Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. And today's video is going to be on the conversion issue again, but this time it's going to be a review of one of the responses of the Rambam. I'm going to apologize ahead of time for the sound quality in this video because I have a new headset and I'm still trying to figure out how to get it to work correctly with my computer. Okay, so in continuation to the claim that I made in a previous video, where that there's no mitzvah requiring the Jewish community to perform a conversion, meaning that there's a mitzvah for how there's mitzvot, lots of mitzvot, of how Jewish people are to treat someone who converts to the Torah, to Torah Moshe. But there's no requirement or no mitzvah that says you must do so, and there's nothing in halacha that requires a must, conversion. There's a choice of a conversion, meaning a community or bet din can convert someone, but there's no requirement for them to do it. It's only if it's in their own interest to decide to do it. They can choose to do it or choose not to do it. So this it comes in response, for example, to a comment that was made on my other video, where someone brought up, the issue, and I'm going to answer this question: is it true that the Rambam insisted on the conversion of a slave girl in one of his teshuvot? Now, the first thing is you have to understand what the question is before you can deal with what the response of the Rambam was. So first of all, I'm going to say up front, the issue here is not a slave girl, because what you're going to see pretty soon in the language is that there are different meanings of the words. The word used in the Shelah is different than the word slave implies in English, for example. So I'm going to already say before you walk into this issue, you're going to have to get rid of any Western concepts that a person may have about certain words. But the first thing is we have to analyze the She'elah, the question that was asked to the Rambam, before we can even analyze what the Rambam's response to it was. The structure of this document is as follows. On the right side is where you have the original Judeo-Arabic, meaning that the person who asked the Rambam a question sent it in this form here, where it's a type of Arabic that's written in Hebrew script, but it includes a lot of Jewish terminology, so that a native Arabic speaker who didn't know Jewish terminology, didn't know Jewish culture, didn't know the Torah, didn't know the Tanakh, didn't know Halacha, would have a harder time understanding what's written here. Even if they would understand certain parts of it, they wouldn't fully understand it, but the problem they'd also have is that they couldn't read it. So this was the type of communication that Jews used between different areas. So again, on the right side is the Judeo-Arabic question that the person sent to the Rambam. And on the left side is the Hebrew translation. So I'm going to use mostly the Hebrew translation side, except for in areas where the Judeo-Arabic side has something that's important. And that's mainly because my pronunciation of Judeo-Arabic sometimes is lacking, even if I read it and understand it. So essentially starting with the Hebrew section of what's written here. The questioner, the person who asked the She'elah to the Rambam, says the following. מה יאמר אדוננו בדבר בחור שקנה שפחו יפת תואר והיא אצלו בחצרו. So anytime you see me using colored borders around certain statements or words, that means that there's something important that I'm going to be drawing on once I finish reading it. And he continues, וחצר גדולה והוא דר עם אשת אביו ושלוש בנותיה הקטנות. נפלו דין ודבורים בינו ובין אחו, תבעו האח אל השופט, ויראו ביניהם דין והדבורים הרבה. אחר כך הלשין אחו אותו אל השופט, שקנה שפחו נוצרית וגיירו, והו מתייחד עמה. So how to understand this? Starting at the beginning, basically this questioner asked the Rambam that in his community there's a Jewish man, a Jewish man who was bought a shivcha. Now, to understand what a shivcha essentially is like a female servant, but it's not like the way people understand it as a slave. For example, a shivcha, in order to have a shivcha during the times of the Torah, you would essentially have to make sure she keeps the Shiva mitzvot of Noach. That's actually one of the requirements. She can't be a shivcha within a certain period of time in a Jewish household unless she keeps like the Shiva mitzvot of Noach. And essentially all the mitzvot that are required of born Jewish women, most of those are also for her to do also. And that's basically the main difference. And then after a certain period of time, when her time of being a shivcha was over, had to be released. And what happened was that she could be given the opportunity to become Jewish as part of the Jewish community. She could choose to accept that or reject it, but essentially, the requirement is the shivcha has to first of all keep the shiva mitzvot and that's going to be important to what's being described here. So the questioner, still in the red box, is saying that there's a man who bought a shivcha as a yafat toar, and he's saying that this woman is at the man's place, like within the gates of where he lives. And he continues outside of the red box and says that basically there's a big courtyard area, or like a fenced-in area, you could say, where the man lives with his father's wife and also like her three daughters, her three young daughters. And basically, there was an issue, which is starting in the blue box a little bit below. It says there's an issue where the man's brother took him to court. Now, what's important here is when you continue, when it says his brother made accusations to him in a court, that it says Now, what's important here is that the shofet that's being mentioned is actually a Muslim shofet, meaning that it's a judge who's a Muslim judge, because this was in a Muslim country. So essentially what happened was you have a brother who takes his brother to court, and not in the Jewish court, but in a Muslim court. And what says continuing is that there were a lot of issues that came up in this court issue between them. So in the kind of brown box, it says Achar kach lashin. So basically, the brother brought a number of accusations about his, the first person mentioned. That basically he says that his brother had bought a shivcha, was in this particular translation says it was Christian, and then he converted her because it says shekana shivcha notsuriya v'gayara who mityachedim. So the brother is accusing his brother of buying the shivcha that was a Christian, and then converting her, and then basically living with her, or even almost like being with her as if she was his wife, on the sense. Or it also could be that he's just basically saying that he has her on his property, if you will. So in the Arabic, it's a little bit more clear that it may not be that she's basically a Christian, but it says shivcha arlo وجراحه وهو متيخر عما بخسارات بآل جوريا وسأله. So essentially what it's saying here is that in the Arabic it's just kind of, it doesn't say specifically she's Christian. When it says shivcha arlo, it basically means that she's like someone who, from the nations of people who are not circumcised, which is probably why it's mentioned that she's a Natsuriya. Since in this situation, this probably would have been the more likely situation of her being in this Islamic country and having protected rights, but not being Jewish. Now, what's important here is in the notes. The notes specifically mention that something important to note about this era, that is during this time in this location, when this was written, there was actually an Islamic law, a Sharia law, that basically made it so that a person could not be sold into slavery if they were Christian or Jewish. And that's what's going to be important about what's coming up next. Continuing, it states, באה השפחה לפני השופט, ושאלה השופט מה היא, אמרה יהודייה. הציעה לה השעות, וסרבה ואמרה אני יהודייה בת יהודייה אני. It's in the red. החזיר אותה לו השופט ולחכם ולביתו ורננה עליו העיר והיא עכשיו נשארה בביתו. And then continue in the blue. האם צריכים בית דין להוציאה ומביתו משום ייחוד, אף על פי שלא יתאחד עמה, משום שנאמר והייתם נקיים מהשם ומישראל, או נאמר משום שאשת אביו עמו וחצר. איננו חייבים להוציאה מאצלו. ואם בית דין צריכים, and then I'll continue on the next slide with that same part there at the end. But what's important here is in the red, when the Islamic judge, the shofet, who was a judge, a Muslim judge, asked her, "What are you?" She says that she's Jewish. She says Yehudiya. And then when he says okay, well, and he's asking Tziyala, meaning that this situation is a pretty critical situation of she was bought as a shivcha, and and she was originally, let's say, like someone who wasn't Jewish or someone who was Christian, for example, and this person bought her as a shivcha, well, that was against the law. and he's basically asking, saying like, hey, about the damage that this is going to do, or it's like saying, do you know that this is against the law? What's happening here? And it says that Sarba wa Mura, she basically like kind of said like, no, 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 I knew you diapati of diani. So essentially, she's trying to say that she was the daughter of a Jew also. So this is a pretty serious situation where essentially, if you look at this way, it's like saying she was lying to the judge about what her background was. Um, in which, if you do accept that she was Jewish, for example, which according to the brother who made the claim to the judge that his brother had converted her, even if she was born Jewish and even if she was converted, it doesn't matter. He couldn't live with her in that way. So the questioner here is asking the Rambam, concerning this issue, because the judge says the judge returned her back to the man, and that this caused a big stir, amongst the people there. And essentially, what he's asking is, the Rambam is, do they need another bit? Do they need a bit din to remove the woman from the man's house? For the sake of yichud, meaning the possibility that he may, be in contact with her in a way that's not, according to the Torah. Um, and he's saying that even if nevertheless he didn't like sleep with her, for example, still there's the issue of him being clean before Hashem and being clean before the people of Israel, meaning the community. Or is it just it's okay to say, okay, well, she's in an area where his his father's mother's there, so then they don't have to remove her. This is the question, about removing her or to not remove her. Remove her because of the fact that there's a chance of Yehud, because of the fact that he bought her as a shivchol, and then he converted her, and she even says the judge that she's Jewish. Um, and also the issue of the law being an issue, that if he did buy her as a shivchol, even if she was Jewish, he was, according to the law that was there, he wouldn't be able to buy her as a shivchol, even if she was not Jewish, if she was like Christian, he wouldn't buy her as a shivchol. Now, closing this off, the questioner says, "L'hotzi'ah me'etzlo," and then in the red it says, "Ve'im bet din tzorechim le'hotzi'ah, me'eze ta'am tiyeh hotza'ata, לפי שלא מצינו שאסרו אלא ייחוד פניה פנויה וייחוד בגויה, באיזה טעם נאסור ישיבתה בביתו, והאם לה דין יפה תואר אם לא. יורנו ברבנו וזכרו כפול מן השמיים." And basically, what he's saying here is the question ends off by saying, under what, conditions are we, should a bet dean remove, this person? If it's to remove her, under what premise should be removing her? The fact that he's, with someone he's not married to, for example, a woman that he's not married to, or under the auspice that he's with, a non-Jewish woman who's living in his house or living in this area that he's in. Under what circumstances, are we saying that if we're to remove her, what should be done? So the idea being here that she should be removed from the house because of the fact that she's not supposed to be there under those circumstances. Now, one of the things that was interesting, I talked to some people about this, and one of the rabbis I talked to said something real interesting about this. He was saying that one of the things you have to look at here is that the man who bought this woman as a shivchol essentially it appears to have converted her for the sake of knowing that he couldn't have her in the household like as a shivchol because it was against the law for him to do that. So essentially, he converted her already in order to be able to take away that claim that for example, that he had this woman who was previously a nutzriya or something like that living in his household. So when she told the judge, the judge asked her like, "What exactly are you?" And she says, "I'm a Jew and I'm the daughter of a Jew." That essentially that was put out there in order to take away the risk, of the original person, being in trouble legally. And the brother knew the situation, knew that he bought someone who was a shivchol, was not Jewish, who was like a Natsriya, for example, according to this one translation, and that essentially, converted her in order to be able to take away the claim that he was, doing that. But the fact is that, he's in a kind of a bad situation either way. In one sense, if she was converted and she was Jewish because of the conversion, he can't live with her in that close proximity like that because he's not married to her. And the other issue is okay, if he didn't convert her, then he's living with someone who's also not Jewish, as a woman, and he's not married to her either, and he can't marry her, and he can't be around her, and he can't, be in that situation. So this is the understanding of the question itself. So now we're going to deal with how to understand the Rambam's Teshuvot, of this particular question. What exactly was the Rambam's response and how to understand it? So the Rambam has the following teshuvah, meaning the following response to it. In the red, he says, "Ein la din yefat lefi shezot nitiyachada b'din Torah, mishum ha'odar lechacham liisha be'oto ha'et, Rabbeinu Amar be'et ha'kivush, shehi v'goyatam, מפני שלא דבר דיבורי תורה, אלא כנגד היצר, כמו ההותר להם באותו העת לאכול האסורים, ובהתאם מלאים כל הטוב ואפילו גדלי נחזירים, ואין להקיש על זה. In the blue, וצריכים בית דין אחר, זאת השמועה, אשר לא טובה לחפותו, להוציאה, או ישחררה, וישענה לאישה. And I'll read the next part that's at the end in the next section. So essentially what the Rambam does is when he responds, he first deals with the issue of the question of whether she was a Yofat Tahara. I don't think I talked about this in the question. The original questioner, one of the things he brought up was whether or not she could be considered a Yofat Tahara. And what that is in the Torah, it mentions that whenever there was a war, when the Jewish army, when there was a Jewish nation, fought a war, if there was a situation where man was overcome by what's called his Yetzer, Yetzer, and sees like a woman who's not Jewish, who's in this nation that the war is happening with, and he decides to take her and bring her to his house and try to make her his wife. Essentially, the Torah forbids him from being able to just up and do that. He can't just take her and then all of a sudden, hold her hostage and say, "You're my wife." All of a sudden, the basic requirement the Torah put out there is that he would have to go through a period of not being around her, and she would have to, basically mourn for her family and her practices, especially if she was from a nation that did avodah zarah, and that essentially she would be given like a month to be able to cut her hair off and grow her nails long so that the man could see her for what for how she really is, and then maybe that this desire he had to take her might go away, and then if he doesn't want to marry her at that point, he would have to kind of give her some money and then send her on her way, and he couldn't make her into a slave or anything like that. The other issue is if she wanted to marry him and if he decided to marry her, then she would have to go through another group of months where she would go through a giyur, meaning she would have to become Jewish and learn about the Torah and things like that. And then only after all of that period, which is almost more than a year, he would have to he would be able to marry her at that point if that was what they both wanted to do. So Rambam's saying that that's not what she is because that's only during a time when there's a war and that's not connected to the situation, and we don't have to make a judgment on this based on that situation. Now what he says in the blue at the bottom is that basically what needs to happen is to bring in a bet din, another bet din, to hear all these issues and to basically determine whether or not there's a need to remove the woman or to basically tell the man that he has to set her free. He can't have her as a shifchol, and that he has to marry her. And this is the thing. The Rambam's giving two options here, and it's nothing to do with conversion. And that's what's important. He's not telling them they have to convert because, again, she's already converted, if you will, because that was what was done in order to, protect her status and protect the man's interest in her being a shifchal. The only way he could do it was to convert her and then claim that she was there. But the Rambam's saying that he can't do that. He can't have her there like that in the situation. So the options are the Bet Din has to either decide to remove her, or they have to decide to tell the man that he has to marry, to set her free. She can't be a shivchal, and then he has to marry her. Again, same issues before. I didn't mention this before, that the right side is the Judeo-Arabic and the left side is the Hebrew. And in this section, it's not yet necessary to really go through the Arabic. It's basically saying mostly the same thing. So continuing, the Rambam ends the teshuvah of his in this way. He says, "V'af al pi sheyesh bazeh ki'ain avera, lefi shenid'an al hashibcho, v'dishtacharoro, asur lo le'isano lechatchila, לפי שכבר פסקנו פעמים אחדים ככגון אלו המקוראים שישחררו ויזענו, ועשינו זאת מפני תקנת השבים, ואמרנו מוטב שיאכול רוטב ולא שומן עצמו, וסמכנו על דבריהם, זיכרונו לברכה, על לעשות לי להשם עבורו תורתך, ומסעין לו ליסענו בדעות ברוך, ויקבעו לו מאוד ליסענו או להוציאה, כמו שעשה עזרא עליו השלום. והאלוהים יתקן כאן לכולנו, כמו שהבטיח ואמר, ואסירה כל בדי לכו, B'chatav Moshe. So translating this, basically what the Rambam says is that this is basically what the man has committed is an avirah. Nevertheless, we still have to deal with it. We still have to make a determination of exactly what to do. And essentially, what he's saying is that it's basically a sore for this man to have like taken her as a shivcha, and then like to basically try to have this idea that he was basically going to try to marry her and all that kind of stuff at that point. Basically what he's saying is that the solution what you have here is that they should the bet dean should essentially try to help the man marry her if that's what basically what is going to happen, and that they should have him set a date. They should set a date for him to either marry her or to set her free, to let her go. And basically he's quoting, basically saying from like that was done during the time of Ezra, where during the time of Ezra, when the Jewish people came back to the land of Israel from the Babylonian exile, there were a number of men who had married non-Jewish women and had children with them, and these women did not convert and were not keeping the Torah, and essentially, they were raising children who weren't, basically according to halakha, they weren't Jewish children. So Ezra told the men to basically send away those wives and children, the ones who won't accept the Torah. And that's essentially what was done in order to fix the situation that they were in. And basically the Rambam describes this as a very bad situation, based upon very bad standards that this man used to do what he was doing. And again, what's important here is the Rambam gives two options here. He says one option is to have, basically the man can marry her, but he would have to set her free first and then marry her. And then the other option is to have her removed. That essentially the Bet Din removes the woman from his house. And if you notice that in not any part of this did he mention anything about converting the woman, because it wasn't relevant to the situation. The two options are that the man has to set her free. She can't be a shivcha to him. He has to set her free and then marry her, or she has to be removed by the Bet Din. So let's deal with the conclusion to this whole entire thing, especially going back to the original question that was brought up about not question, but I guess the comment that was made earlier that somebody had made, that essentially what the Rambam was trying to push that they should convert the woman. But as we see that that's not at all what the Rambam was pushing. If we really analyze the entire story, understanding the history of what's being mentioned, and understanding all the details. So what we see here is that the Rambam's advice in this area was that the questioner and his community should first of all that they should try to help the man marry the woman, that they should fix a date where either the man has to set her free and marry her, or she has to be removed. That the man can't continue to live with her in his house like that under those circumstances. And then basically he quotes the situation of Ezra Sofer during the time of Ezra. Jewish men returned to the land of Israel with wives that were not Jewish, and essentially that they did not want to become Jewish, did not want to take on the Torah, and these men had children by them, and that they basically removed the women and the children, and they had to be sent back to where they were from. Because of this. So, basically he's referencing that situation. But these are the two options that the Rambam says that they have. And again, there's nothing about conversion in anything he said, because he didn't say convert her, anything like that. He said, man has to set her free because he took her as a shivcha, and he has to basically either set her free and marry her, or she has to be removed from his house. She can't live in his house like that. And again, as I mentioned, conversion was not the issue, and she did not have to convert because. So as we had mentioned before, the brother here had actually claimed that the woman was put as a shivcha, and then that the person converted her, and that she was living with the person. So again, this was against the law for him to have bought her as a shivcha, and then for example, in order to get around the law, this person tried and converted her, so that when she went to the judge, essentially when the judge asked her what she was, she says that it says in the Arabic, "Ana Yehudiya adiyol, banat Yehudiyo ano." So essentially, she's trying to say, well, I'm Jewish, she also says, according to this particular text, I'm the daughter of a Jew. So as we can see, the Rambam did not make any mention of converting her, because the original question was pretty clear that the man had already converted her. The issue is that her being in this situation of being a shivcha was wrong. first of all, the man could not buy her under those circumstances and do that to her in that circumstance. And the second thing was that she was living in an area where, there was the issue of yichud with the man. So essentially, the man was given two options, by the Rambam, at least, to deal with the situation. One was for the man to set her free, so she was no longer be a shibcha, and then he would have to marry her, or she would have to be removed. So this is answering this question. I hope that everybody understands where it's coming from. And I took it on a textual basis, and I hope everything is okay for where you are. Be safe. Take care.